If you are new here, there is a specific reason this message is reaching you now, and it is not comfort. It is awareness. Returning viewers already understand the direction this channel moves in: quiet discipline, emotional control, and a clearer reading of human behavior. For everyone, new or returning, turn on subtitles. Not for decoration, but because the meaning in this one depends on precision. Now listen closely, because this starts in a way most people misunderstand immediately. The moment you try too hard to be liked, something subtle shifts in how people value you. Not loudly, not instantly, but irreversibly. And the strange part is, they rarely tell you. They simply adjust their behavior toward you. Less attention, shorter responses, fewer invitations, a quieter form of exclusion that looks like nothing on the surface, but feels like distance you cannot explain. You start thinking you need to improve your personality, your tone, your presence. So you try harder, and that is where the loop begins. Because the harder you try to be liked, the less you are respected. Not because kindness is weak, not because warmth is wrong, but because excessive approval-seeking signals something precise about your internal structure. It signals instability of identity. People may not articulate it, but they sense when someone is adjusting themselves in real time just to maintain approval. It creates a predictable pattern. You agree too quickly. You soften your opinions before they are challenged. You laugh slightly longer than necessary. You fill silence that was never yours to fill. You believe you are being socially smooth. What others observe is something different. They observe someone negotiating their presence. And negotiation is not respected in human psychology. It is managed, tolerated, sometimes used, but rarely respected. Now there is a specific misunderstanding here that keeps most people trapped for years. They assume being liked automatically leads to being respected. So they optimize for likability. More agreeable, more available, more accommodating. But respect does not grow from accessibility. It grows from perceived internal stability. And internal stability is communicated through something very subtle: the absence of overreaction to social feedback. Think about how people behave around someone they genuinely respect. They adjust themselves slightly. They choose words more carefully. They do not assume unlimited access. Not because the person demanded it, but because the person did not signal dependency on approval. Now contrast that with someone who constantly seeks validation. There is no psychological boundary to respect, only emotional availability. And emotional availability without boundaries does not create admiration. It creates usage. You might not notice it at first because it feels like social engagement. People talk to you. They respond. They laugh. But the underlying structure is different. You are not being interacted with as an equal center of gravity. You are being interacted with as a flexible surface. Something that adjusts to others easily. And human psychology interprets flexibility without boundaries as low resistance. Low resistance is not respected. It is navigated. There is a moment in almost everyone's life where this becomes visible, but most people misinterpret it. You say yes when you want to say no. You explain yourself when no explanation was required. You offer extra effort when none was requested. And in your mind, you are building goodwill. But in the other person's mind, something more silent forms. Awareness that you can be slightly repositioned socially without consequence. That is the beginning of reduced respect. Not rejection, not hostility, just repositioning. And once that repositioning happens, your future interactions are already framed differently. You are no longer someone whose reactions must be considered carefully. You are someone whose response is predictable. And predictability, in social hierarchy, is a form of downgrade. There is a reason strong presence often appears quiet. Not because silence itself is powerful, but because unnecessary verbal and emotional compensation weakens perceived internal structure. People who are secure in themselves do not rush to fill gaps in perception. They do not chase agreement. They do not correct every misunderstanding about them. They allow space to exist without interference. And that space does something important. It forces others to interpret them, rather than be managed by them. The moment you start managing how you are perceived too aggressively, you remove that interpretive space. And once interpretation is removed, respect has nowhere to form. Now, you may notice something uncomfortable here. Some people you have tried hardest to impress are also the ones who treat you with the least seriousness over time. Not because they are malicious, but because they learned your pattern. They learned that your behavior adjusts around their reaction. And once that pattern is learned, the dynamic is set. You are no longer entering interactions as a stable identity. You are entering as a responsive identity. And responsive identities are always evaluated lower in human hierarchy perception, even if no one consciously admits it. There is also a deeper layer here that most people avoid recognizing. When you try too hard to be liked, you are indirectly communicating fear. Fear of exclusion, fear of disapproval, fear of being misunderstood and left uncorrected. And fear, when expressed socially, does not produce protection. It produces leverage, because people naturally sense what can be emotionally influenced. And what can be influenced can be positioned. This is why some individuals without being openly dominant still command more respect in silence than others who constantly attempt to be socially perfect. It is not effort that is missing. It is resistance. Now, at this point, you might assume the answer is to become cold or indifferent. That is a misunderstanding as well. Because the opposite of approval seeking is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional non-dependence. There is a difference. One avoids connection. The other stops negotiating identity through connection. Most people never experience that difference clearly, so they stay stuck oscillating between trying too hard and shutting down completely. Neither produces respect. One produces access without boundaries. The other produces distance without presence. Respect exists in a narrower space between those extremes, where your behavior is consistent but not reactive. Where your agreement is intentional, not automatic. Where your presence is steady, not shaped by approval feedback loops. And here is where things begin to tighten psychologically. Because once people notice you are no longer adjusting yourself immediately to their reactions, their behavior toward you changes again. Sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly, and you start to see something you did not see before. Respect was never fully absent. It was conditional, conditioned on how easily you could be influenced. Now pause that thought, because it connects to something deeper that most people only realize too late in their relationships, friendships, and even workplace dynamics. But before that unfolds, there is a specific turning point where everything either continues repeating or starts breaking. And that turning point begins with what you stop doing, not what you start doing. At some point, you begin to notice a pattern that feels almost uncomfortable to admit. The more effort you put into being understood, the more people assume they already understand you. Not accurately, not deeply, just enough to stop paying attention. This is where most approval-seeking behavior becomes self-defeating in a way people never connect in real time. You explain yourself to reduce misunderstanding. But what you actually reduce is curiosity. And without curiosity, respect has nothing to attach itself to. There is a psychological mechanism at play here that operates quietly in every interaction. When someone has to continuously clarify, adjust, or soften their position, the listener unconsciously updates their internal model of that person. Not as someone complex, but as someone negotiable. And negotiable people are not treated with the same cognitive weight as non-negotiable ones. This is not about arrogance. It is about perceived internal structure. A stable person does not require constant explanation to remain stable in the eyes of others. Their reactions are consistent enough that people stop testing them unnecessarily. But when your reactions shift depending on who you are with, the environment starts to treat you as context-dependent. And context-dependent identity is fragile in social hierarchy. You might think you are simply being adaptable. But what others perceive is different. They perceive someone whose position is not anchored. And if a position is not anchored, it can be gently shifted without resistance. That is when respect begins to degrade without confrontation. It is not taken from you. It is quietly withdrawn. You can see this most clearly in small moments. A joke you would normally not accept, but you laugh at anyway. An opinion you disagree with, but you let it pass without correction. A request you should decline, but you accept because saying no feels like friction you want to avoid. Each moment seems insignificant in isolation. But together, they form a behavioral pattern that others eventually map. And once mapped, they no longer treat your reactions as signals of boundary. They treat them as signals of availability. This is where something subtle shifts in human interaction. People begin to test limits without realizing they are testing anything at all. A slightly disrespectful tone, a delayed response, a request that edges beyond reasonable expectation. Not because they are trying to dominate you, but because your previous behavior suggested there is no firm edge to hit. And when there is no edge, people unconsciously extend behavior until they find one. This is how respect erodes without conflict. And you often misread it as familiarity or closeness. But familiarity without boundaries is not intimacy. It is accessibility. And accessibility is always ranked lower than defined presence. There is a reason some individuals are remembered differently in the same room, even when they speak less. They are not more expressive. They are more consistent in emotional weight. Their agreement feels intentional, not automatic. Their disagreement feels calm, not reactive. Their silence feels complete, not empty. This creates a psychological effect where others begin to monitor themselves around them. Not because they are feared, but because they are not easily influenced. Now contrast that with someone who tries to be liked. That person often becomes emotionally readable in real time. You can see when they are adjusting, when they are seeking approval, when they are trying to maintain alignment with the group dynamic. And once emotional readability becomes too easy, something interesting happens. People stop adjusting themselves around you. Because there is no need to. You are already adjusting yourself for them. This is the reversal most people never detect until much later. They believe they are increasing social connection. But they are actually lowering their perceived position within it. There is also a deeper consequence that emerges over time. When your identity is shaped around being liked, your decisions begin to lose internal reference. You stop asking, "Is this aligned with me?" and start asking, "Will this be accepted?" That shift is not just behavioral. It is structural, because it means your internal authority is no longer the primary driver of action. External reaction is. And once external reaction becomes the driver, respect becomes unstable in all directions. People can sense when someone's behavior is optimized for response rather than principle. And even if they cannot articulate it, they adjust accordingly. You may notice this in subtle social dynamics. Your presence is welcomed, but not centered. Your opinions are acknowledged, but not weighted heavily. Your contributions are included, but not anchored in group direction. You are part of the interaction, but not shaping it. And at first, you may not question it, because inclusion feels like validation. But inclusion is not the same as influence. And influence is where respect actually lives. There is a point where you might try to fix this by becoming even more agreeable, more helpful, more available. But that direction only deepens the pattern. Because it reinforces the same signal. Your behavior is flexible enough to be shaped without cost. And anything without cost is never treated as rare. Now here is the uncomfortable part most people resist. Respect is not given for being pleasant. It is given for being stable under social pressure. Meaning your presence does not dissolve when others apply subtle force. Force does not always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like expectation. Sometimes it looks like silence waiting for you to fill it. Sometimes it looks like disagreement delivered casually to see if you retract your position. And in those moments, your reaction teaches people more about you than anything you say. If you adjust immediately, you communicate dependency on harmony. If you resist unnecessarily, you communicate emotional volatility. But if you remain steady, unaffected, and intentional, you communicate something else entirely. Internal control. And internal control is where respect begins to stabilize again. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped revealing instability in exchange for approval. Now, at this stage, something starts to happen internally. You begin to feel a shift in how interactions land. Some people respond differently when you stop over-explaining. Others become slightly more careful in how they engage with you. And a few may pull back without explanation. Not because you became worse, but because you became less predictable in a specific way they were benefiting from. And this is where most people hesitate. Because losing unpredictable approval feels like loss. But what is actually leaving is not respect. It is access without adjustment cost. And what begins to replace it is something quieter. Recognition of presence that does not bend automatically. There is a threshold point where this becomes undeniable, but it only appears when you stop chasing immediate social correction. And that threshold leads into a different kind of identity entirely. One where you are no longer performing alignment. You are simply observing interaction without surrendering structure. And once that shift begins, the entire social dynamic starts reorganizing itself around you in ways you did not actively initiate. But before that restructuring becomes clear, You have to pass through a phase where silence becomes more powerful than explanation. And most people never stay long enough in that phase to see what comes next. There is a moment in social behavior that most people never consciously register, yet it determines almost everything about how they are treated. It happens when you say less than expected, and nothing collapses. No awkwardness, no loss of connection, no need to repair anything. Just silence that holds its shape. For someone used to trying to be liked, that silence feels wrong at first. Almost like you forgot to complete something. Like you left a gap open that should be filled with explanation, reassurance, or extra effort. So the instinct is to fix it. To speak more, to clarify, to soften, to add context that was never requested. But the critical shift begins when you don't. When you allow the silence to remain intact. Because in that moment, something invisible happens in the mind of the other person. They start interpreting you instead of managing you. And interpretation is where respect begins to form. Not certainty, not comfort, interpretation. When people cannot fully predict your next emotional adjustment, they begin to pay closer attention. Not out of fear, out of recalibration. They are updating their internal model of who you are. And the most important part is this: they are now doing the work you used to do for them. You used to constantly adjust yourself so others would not misread you. Now they are adjusting their perception of you to avoid misreading you. This reversal is subtle, but structurally significant. Because respect is not built when you make yourself easier to understand. It is built when others realize they cannot reduce you to an automatic response. That reduction is what approval-seeking behavior unknowingly invites. You become emotionally predictable, and emotional predictability removes tension from social space. But tension is not always negative in human psychology. Measured tension creates attention, and attention, when not freely given away, becomes a signal of value. This is where the pattern begins to change in real time. You stop explaining minor misunderstandings. You stop correcting every misinterpretation. You stop reacting immediately to every shift in tone. And something unexpected happens. People begin to slow down around you. Not because you demanded it, but because their previous assumptions no longer receive automatic confirmation. There is a gap now between stimulus and your response. And in that gap, perception becomes active instead of passive. This is where respect quietly grows back, but in a different form than before. Not based on approval, based on unreadability of emotional reaction. Now, this is often misunderstood. Unreadability does not mean emotional emptiness. It means emotional independence from immediate validation loops. You still feel, you still respond, but not in a way that broadcasts internal instability for social approval. And people register this difference more than they admit. Because most social environments are built on constant micro-adjustments. Someone laughs slightly longer to maintain harmony. Someone agrees slightly faster to avoid friction. Someone apologizes slightly earlier to prevent discomfort. These micro-adjustments create a shared illusion of smooth interaction. But beneath it, people are constantly reading each other for stability signals. And when one person stops participating in that constant adjustment loop, the entire dynamic shifts. At first, they may interpret it as distance. Then as confidence. Then, if it persists, as authority. Not authority in the loud sense. Authority in the non-reactive sense. The kind that does not rush to correct its own existence. Now here is where approval-seeking behavior creates a long-term contradiction. The more you try to be liked, the more you expose your sensitivity to reaction. And the more sensitive you appear to reaction, the more people unconsciously test that sensitivity. Not aggressively, subtly. A delayed reply here, a slightly dismissive tone there. A request that stretches your availability a bit further each time. And you comply, not because you are weak, but because you are optimizing for social continuity. But each compliance slightly shifts your position downward in perceived stability. Because what people learn over time is simple. You adjust when pressure is applied. And anything that adjusts easily under pressure is not treated as structurally firm. This is where respect begins to fragment into something more transactional. People still interact with you. But the underlying assumption changes. You are now someone who maintains harmony, not someone who defines it. And this difference is everything in social hierarchy perception. There is a point where you might try to recover respect by increasing effort again. More engagement, more helpfulness, more emotional availability. But this does not restore the original perception. It reinforces the updated one. Because effort without boundaries does not read as strength. It reads as compensation. And compensation signals imbalance. Now, something important begins to surface here. People who are deeply liked are not always deeply respected. And people who are deeply respected are not always widely liked. These are not the same currency. They move in different psychological systems. One is based on emotional comfort. The other is based on perceived internal structure. And when you confuse the two, you begin optimizing for the wrong outcome. You chase warmth when the situation requires clarity. You chase acceptance when the situation requires presence. You chase inclusion when the situation requires defined boundaries. And over time, your social position becomes softer, not stronger. But there is a turning point where this cycle can break. It does not require aggression. It does not require withdrawal. It requires removal of unnecessary social compensation. Meaning you stop adding extra emotional explanation to neutral situations. You stop over-clarifying your intentions. You stop performing reassurance for reactions that were never actually demands. And when you do this consistently, something begins to shift in how your presence is processed. People start to fill in gaps differently. They become more careful with assumptions. They begin to consider your reactions more deliberately before speaking. Not because you changed your personality, but because you removed automatic access to your internal adjustments. And that changes the entire structure of interaction. Now, there is a subtle discomfort that appears during this phase. Because some people who were comfortable with your previous responsiveness may feel the shift immediately. They may become slightly distant, or slightly more attentive, or slightly uncertain, not because anything was said, but because the familiar predictability is gone, and in its place is something less controllable. And that uncertainty is the beginning of respect reformation. Not full respect yet, but the conditions where respect can exist again without dependency on approval loops. At this stage, the most important thing is not to revert. Because reverting is what collapses the new perception and restores the old pattern. And most people do revert. They feel the distance and immediately increase effort again, trying to restore comfort, not realizing they are dismantling the only shift that was moving them toward stability. But if you stay in this state long enough, something deeper becomes visible. Your presence stops being evaluated purely on emotional accessibility, and starts being measured against consistency. And consistency, once noticed, is very difficult to ignore, because it begins to anchor how others behave around you without you instructing them to do so. And that is where the next stage begins. When your silence, your restraint, and your lack of unnecessary adjustment start to reshape how others position themselves in relation to you. But that transformation only becomes permanent when you stop seeking immediate confirmation that it is working. And most people fail exactly there, because they want validation for withdrawing validation-seeking behavior. And that contradiction pulls them back into the loop. The final shift requires something quieter, not reaction, observation, and the ability to let perception update without interference. And once that begins to settle, the structure of respect changes in ways you no longer need to chase. It starts to stabilize on its own, but only after you stop trying to stabilize it manually. And that is where everything moves into its final form. At this point, something becomes obvious that you were not supposed to notice earlier. Respect was never missing because you lacked value. It was unstable because you kept negotiating your value in real time. That negotiation is what people feel, even when they cannot name it. And once they feel it, they stop treating you as fixed. They treat you as adjustable. This is the final consequence of trying too hard to be liked. You don't disappear socially. You become socially repositionable. And repositionable people are always evaluated through convenience, not depth. Now the shift you have been moving toward is not about becoming less expressive or less human. It is about removing the reflex to adjust yourself immediately after external feedback. There is a pause that changes everything. A space between what happens and how you respond. Most people collapse that space instantly. Approval seeking collapses it the fastest, because it cannot tolerate uncertainty in perception. But when you stop collapsing that space, your behavior begins to change in a way others can feel before they can explain. You no longer rush to correct misunderstandings that do not threaten your integrity. You no longer over-explain neutral reactions. You no longer repair social tension that was never actually damaged. And in that restraint, something important forms. Weight, not emotional intensity, psychological weight. People begin to factor you differently in conversations. Not because you speak more, but because when you do speak, it no longer feels like compensation. It feels deliberate, and deliberate communication carries a different status in human perception systems. Now, there is a misunderstanding that often appears at this stage. People think this creates distance. In reality, it removes artificial closeness. And artificial closeness is what approval-seeking behavior often builds. A constant stream of reassurance signals. Constant availability. Constant emotional smoothing. It feels like connection, but it is actually maintenance work for other people's comfort. When that maintenance stops, the system feels unfamiliar at first. Not worse, just unstructured. And in that unstructured space, people begin to recalibrate how they relate to you. Some will step back, not because they dislike you, but because the previous dynamic required less cognitive effort from them. Others will begin to observe more carefully, because now your responses carry uncertainty again. And uncertainty increases attention. This is where respect begins to separate itself from familiarity. Familiarity was built on predictability. Respect begins to form when predictability is no longer guaranteed, but stability is still present. That combination is rare, and rarity is what the mind assigns value to. There is also a quieter transformation happening inside you if you stay in this state long enough. You stop performing emotional labor for outcomes you do not control. You stop trying to pre-correct how others interpret you. You stop adjusting your identity based on immediate feedback loops. And what replaces it is not arrogance. It is internal reference. You begin to act from a fixed position instead of a reactive one. And this is where people around you begin to feel a subtle shift they cannot ignore. You are no longer emotionally negotiable in the same way. You are no longer easily pulled into reaction cycles. You are no longer participating in every emotional current that passes through the room. And without realizing it, others begin to adjust their behavior to match your reduced volatility. They become more measured, more intentional, sometimes more respectful, sometimes more distant, but always more aware. And awareness is the first layer of respect. Not admiration, not approval, awareness. Because now, your reactions are no longer guaranteed responses to their behavior. They have to consider you as a separate system, not a reactive extension. That is the real shift. Not becoming less liked, becoming less automatically managed. Now, there is a final contradiction you need to see clearly. Trying to be liked too much does not increase connection. It increases dependency on external calibration. And dependency always lowers perceived authority. Even in friendships, even in relationships, even in casual social spaces. Because authority, in human perception, is simply this: someone who does not lose themselves in the presence of others. Once that is sensed, behavior around you begins to reorganize automatically. You do not need to announce boundaries. They become implied. You do not need to enforce presence. It becomes registered. You do not need to demand respect. It becomes the default response to your consistency. And now everything returns to a quieter state. Not louder. Not more dramatic, just stable. But stability here is not emotional stillness. It is the absence of unnecessary adjustment. And in that absence, your presence becomes harder to ignore in the way that matters. Not because you are trying to be seen, but because you are no longer distorting yourself to avoid being seen incorrectly. There is a final layer to this that most people only recognize in hindsight. The version of you that tried hardest to be liked was not more socially effective. It was more socially available. And availability without structure is what leads to reduced respect over time. The moment you remove that pattern, the entire system begins to shift. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee how many interactions in your past were shaped by your own adjustments rather than others' intentions. Now, there is nothing left to chase here. Only behavior to refine, not for approval, but for alignment with a version of you that does not need to be socially edited in real time. Because that is where respect stabilizes. Not in effort, not in performance, but in consistency that does not bend for immediate acceptance. And if you have followed this far, then the pattern is already visible in your own interactions. What remains is whether you continue feeding it, or begin withdrawing from it quietly enough that even you stop feeling the need to explain the change. Now, do not rush to prove anything from this. Let it settle, and observe what changes without interference. That observation alone will tell you more than any explanation ever could. Silent command. Continue watching the next lessons, because the same pattern shows up everywhere: relationships, money, influence, and identity. And once you recognize it, you stop negotiating your value in spaces that were never meant to define it.